Hello, everybody. Welcome to the NonSequitur Show. I am not Kyle. I'm not Kyle at all. I'm Shannon Q. And I am here with Steve, the illustrious Steve, who is below me, and also James Lindsay, who we're very, very excited to have. Kyle, just to let everybody know, was unable to make it tonight. He is incredibly regretful. He is stranded in Ohio. He went away for the weekend without his computer equipment, thinking he would be back in time. And unfortunately, nature happened and he wasn't able to leave. So everybody is stuck with just me, Steve, and James this evening, but I think it should be a productive conversation. So before we get into Steve letting everybody know what's going to be going on in the Non-Sec Show in the next couple of days, which we're all excited about, James, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody?
Oh man, I hate introducing myself because it means I have to talk about myself. So I'm probably most well known right now for having done some huge audit of what I called grievance studies, this so-called grievance studies affair that some people have dubbed Sokol Squared. That was sort of my operation along with Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose, and that kind of got a lot of attention, like front page of the New York Times on the 5th of October attention. So I'm probably best known for that. My background before that was, let's see, I did a bachelor's degree in physics. I have a master's and PhD in math. Got out of academia in 2010 and started studying philosophy of science, started studying religion, did some writing in the kind of new atheist vein for a few years. And then I've written 4 books since then, but kind of moved more into this kind of cultural, political philosophy sort of thing in the past couple of years.
Awesome, James. Thank you so much. So, Steve, tell everybody what's up. What's gonna go on, and what sort of horrible, awful nonsense.
I'm not sure they want to know. But yeah, I'm Steve, not Shannon, not Dave, not Kyle, not James today. So I'm just going by a bunch of names. But yeah, let's go real quick. What we have coming up tomorrow? Actually, we have something pretty interesting. We got a separation of church and state with A.F. Alexander. She's an ex-conservative Christian author, and she wrote a book called I believe it's called The Religious Right: The Greatest Threat to Democracy. So she's gonna be coming on tomorrow to talk about that. On Thursday, we got Dr. Misha Griffith and Jerry coming back. Not quite sure the topic yet, but you know what? It's whatever they're going to talk about. You know, it has to be good because we love them. They're like
amazing.
The cutest couple. Oh my good! We need to have a poll. Who's cuter, Dr. Misha Griffith and Jerry, or Digital Hammurabi, Megan and Josh? I don't know. It's kind of like
or Shannon and Paul. I'm just saying, but whatever.
No. You guys are the power couple, fine. Okay? You guys are the power couple.
Oh, I'll take it.
Okay.
I'll take whatever arbitrary. Oh, yeah,
well,
that's
they're
right.
A power couple.
God, it'd be so explicit.
I
said
they're an
logic.
Power couple. But they do a lot of beneficial stuff, right? I mean, that donation of the peanut butter and all that. So next week, though, we got CGI Explained with Matthew Walker. We got Simon Dan on Tuesday. We have Prison Reformation on Wednesday. And then a big event on Thursday. We have Aaron Raw and Reformed Christian Apologist. Yeah, what can go wrong there? RCA, I guess he wanted to challenge Aaron. Good luck with him. You know, it was nice knowing RCA while it lasted. I've known him a very long time. I think this might be the end of his YouTube career, but hey, look, I am.
No, Steve, be nice. I like RCA. He's a good guy.
I love RCA.
He's a good guy. I like him. I've never had a bad conversation with him. It's possible to have good conversations with people you disagree with. You know me.
Well, yeah, but I mean, Aaron's going to decimate him on there. Come on, let's be realistic. But anyways, hi, James. Welcome. We have a guest. I didn't even know.
James like, I'm here. Right.
No, I'm just checking it out. It's all good.
Well, welcome, James. So I have a laundry list of questions for you. I had not been exposed to, I suppose, what could be considered your body of work in its entirety. So you also had a lecture I watched on whether or not atheism should be a thing that I thought was interesting. But lately you've been really into the grievance study things and the posting or the submission of and then ultimate publication of several of your fake articles. So for anybody who maybe like me until a couple of weeks ago may not have been familiar with it, would you mind giving just kind of a brief summary or synopsis? I know
Sure.
it's a lot to go into, of what you and Helen and Peter endeavored to do and the motivations behind it.
Sure. So we spent about a year. It gets complicated on the dates, and we can get into the details about all of the timing and all this. We'll say for now about a year, trying to become, well, first trying to hoax and then trying to become scholars in fields that we kind of collectively labeled grievance studies, since they have lots of different names and most of them end in studies like race studies, gender studies, queer studies, masculinity studies, fat studies. You know, you can go on and on with all these different studies. So we collectively lumped them into this term that we called grievance studies. We spent about a year writing academic papers. At first, the first 3 or 4 months, we were trying to do academic hoaxes, just ridiculous satirical pastiches that had no academic merit whatsoever. And then we realized that wasn't going to work, and we were going to crash and burn and probably just embarrass ourselves horrendously, because we had promised to go public with whatever happened. Success or fail, we were going to tell the story to the world. It would have been much less of a story if we would have failed, but we still would have told it. So in November last year, we switched gears. We started actually trying to learn the fields and started trying to produce really, really intentionally broken papers that do have scholarly merit within their disciplines. And we produced 20 papers, probably somewhere between, depending on how you count them, 5 and 7 of those didn't really have academic merit, and the remaining 13 to 15 did. 7 of them were accepted by various academic journals. A few of those journals quite prestigious within the subdisciplines that we were interested in looking at. 4 of them were actually published. One of the published ones got an award. There were 7 more that were still under review or asked to be edited to send back for review. So we considered they were still live and possibilities for getting in if we would have had more time. Our intention was to try to take the project sometime into next year. Probably, ideally, we would have shot to go public at the end of January, but we kind of got caught out. Journalists started digging around one of our papers, because obviously when they get published, they become public, and people started looking at them, started asking questions. So journalists started getting into it. So we ended up going public on October 2nd. Instead of making it through to January, or maybe even as far as May, we had considered to be our last possible date for staying secret. Our motivations were that for the past several years, we've been pretty strongly suspicious that there's something going on in that scholarship, to where papers that are of extraordinarily insufficient academic rigor can be passed through their peer review system and come out as kind of with the imprimatur of knowledge on the other side. And so we wanted to see first if we could trick them into publishing absolute garbage, which we figured out we could not do, and then start to figure out what we could publish and how it works and what the actual problems are that we had kind of been sensing were going on, that we suspected were going on. We decided to test to see if we could figure out exactly what they were and how they work, and to validate that we understand it by getting as many papers accepted as we could. And we ended up, like I said, writing papers. It's about a year, a little over a year, that we were actually actively involved in the project, 14 months from when we started until when we went public, or just short of that. We wrote papers for 10 of those months. And like I said, we cranked out 20 of them in 10 months.
Wow. Okay. So a couple of questions of things that weren't clear for me, that admittedly I only had a couple of weeks to research. So
Sure.
One of the things that wasn't clear for me, is that I couldn't establish for myself in the time that I had allotted, was would you consider these papers to be papers that were of high repute, that people that were currently academics in the field would have found themselves some level of prestige in publishing in, or would have been sought to be published in? The only reason I asked that is because the journals where you publish the papers. And the only reason that I asked that is because I consider myself to be, to give you some background for me, I have a degree in psychology, but I consider myself kind of an outsider in these fields, but I would probably identify as a feminist, and I identify with some of the social justice principles. But I like to pursue open dialogue, and I think that all ideas are open to scrutiny and should be up to the test of rigor.
Sure.
So I'm trying to come at this from that perspective, if you can understand the spirit of my questions.
Sure.
Some people had come to me and essentially leveled the accusation that you were seeking out papers for publication that were like pay to publish, or were the types of papers that somebody who had high academic standing wouldn't have wanted to be published in, but maybe would have had their papers published in as an aside, because that's the type of papers that journal published. So what would you say to that? So in order to kind of, I guess, strengthen your position or counter that?
Oh, sure. So first of all, none of the papers that we published or that we submitted went to a journal that was pay to publish. We used absolutely no pay to publish journals. These were all rigorous peer-reviewed journals. We sought to pick journals that were within their sub-disciplines at the highest level of either impact factor or standing or some such. For example, one of the papers that we had published, I should say accepted, it was going to be published. It had already been typeset but hadn't come out yet, was in the feminist philosophy journal Hypatia, which is the leading feminist philosophy journal. So if you want to talk about feminist philosophy, you don't go higher than Hypatia. And I'm sure that over at Science Journal, which is a feminist journal, they're like, we are, but they don't bill themselves as specifically feminist philosophy, and Hypatia does. Another of our papers went to sex roles, which has an impact factor nearly of 2, given that it's ranked number 1 in gender studies on Google Scholar. Gender and Society is considered the highest ranked gender studies journal, has an impact factor of about 2.75, 2.8, something like that. Maybe I'm off a little. It's up there close to 3, but not at 3. And we submitted a paper to them. They did not accept it. So we were targeting journals that were of the highest level standing that we could within the subdisciplines. So some of our other journals, for example, we had a paper that was published in Sexuality and Culture, and to the best that we could discern, it is probably about the 2nd highest journal in sexuality studies, following after the journal called Sexualities, which rejected our paper, but not because of its merit, but because they said that they had a 2-year backlog because they've had so many papers submitted in sexuality studies recently that they're only accepting the absolute highest level papers. And how in the world is our joke paper is going to be that? We submitted a paper. One of the journals is Fat Studies. So that's clearly not a very big journal. But if you're going to submit a paper in the discipline of fat studies, you're not going to find a journal that's got higher standing than the one called Fat Studies. In fact, there's only, I think, 2 that do fat studies, and it's the one. One journal, I think, that took one of our papers as sort of an accident in a sense. That's the Journal of Poetry Therapy. It kind of got sucked into this. We were targeting qualitative methods journals, but then one suggested that Poetry Therapy would really like it. So we sent it to them thinking it's not going to get in anyway, so why not? And then they accepted it. So they kind of fell backwards into it. I will admit that's a very niche journal, but its impact factor is like 0.3 or 0.2. It's very small. That's fine. But we were mostly targeting journals like Hypatia, Gender and Society, Feminist Theory, Signs. You go down the list, sex roles. You're looking at journals that are within what we would consider grievance studies fields to be really significant journals. We did not submit anything to a pay-to-play journal. No predatory journals were involved. And we looked for the highest impact factor with suitable aims and scope. A lot of our problem was that we wrote our papers typically first before we looked at the journals, and then tried to figure out what journal they would fit in, which is kind of backwards. So it was very difficult because you have to scope, trawl through aims and scope and make sure it's going to fit within the journal. The most popular, famous paper that we did was the dog humping paper. And that went to Gender, Place, and Culture, 25 years, top 10 according to more than one ranking system, top 15 according to pretty much every ranking system in terms of feminism or women's studies or gender studies journals. It's not insignificant. And if you're looking at feminist geography as a specific subdomain, it is the leading feminist geography journal. So it's difficult to say, but certainly none of these none of these journals were paid to publish. All of them had a rigorous peer review. And so whoever leveled those accusations has their information wrong, and I hope they correct it.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you giving an honest answer to the question. All right, so I have so many more questions, and feel free to ask me any questions too, or provide anything. Another.
Well, let me add a little bit to that then real quick.
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
Because this project was kind of born out of, Peter and I tried to do this one before that called The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct. And then that one actually did go to a journal that required pay to publish. And we went public. They accepted it. The peer review was a joke. We went public with it on May 19th, 2017. And people very rightly criticized the crap out of us for using a pay to publish journal, said we tricked ourselves, etc. So we actually designed the Grievance Studies Affair probe or audit, if you want to call it that. We called it a project, so I tend to defer to that word, but it's really an audit. We really designed it around the idea that the criticisms of the conceptual penis were legitimate and we needed to correct for those. So we needed only to use the best standing journals that we could do, and certainly nothing that would require us to pay to publish.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So following up on that a little bit, so you mentioned rigorous peer review a couple of times, and that hurts my head a little bit when you say rigorous peer review, because clearly it couldn't have been, because based on my understanding, and you can please correct me if I'm wrong, because as I said, I only had a brief period of time to research your project or your audit. There were clearly, you were self-referential in certain cases, and you also referenced just fake articles, like your reference section.
No, that was only in the conceptual penis. No, every paper we cited in the 20 papers we wrote for this project, every reference was real. Every single one, every quotation was legitimately pulled from the existing scholarly literature. Those were real papers.
So,
one of the papers was about ourselves, but it didn't reference ourselves. It was actually about the project we did and was criticizing it from a perspective of feminist philosophy. That's the one that got into Hypatia.
Okay, so these seem to be very experiential report fields, based on my understanding. So, like I said, I'm not familiar with the field. So it seems to be an entire field based on perceptual self-reports that
some of that, autoethnography, they often call it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, sorry, psychology term. So if everything is based on sort of self-report or perceptual self-report, then and it's given some sort of valid efficacy based on the publication status, and yours aligned with that, how could a peer review have found out that these were fake? Like, what steps could have been put in place by these fields in order to discover you or your team
that the papers were fake? Well,
right. Yeah. Well, is there a way they
we specifically so every single one of the papers, and there's, of course, there were 20 of them, so there's a ton of detail involved trying to talk about it, if we get specific, and there's a ton of difficulty if we talk about it very generally because of that. But every single paper tried to pick up specific things that were either absolutely absurd or intentionally broken methodology, or completely unethical points that we were actually trying. It's like if I was going to go try to put a brick of cocaine through the thing at the TSA on to get on an airplane, and it's like, in a sense, I want them to figure out that I'm putting a brick of cocaine through there in a shoebox or whatever. So we were putting stuff in our papers like, let's chain white kids to the floor as an educational opportunity, and hoping somebody would say, wait a minute, that's not ethical. Maybe we shouldn't do that.
Right.
And so, if we're going to, the idea was that we were going to try to slide these, well, not even slide, slide these really horrible ideas, whether it's horrible in terms of the scholarship, horrible in terms of the methods, horrible in terms of the interpretation, horrible in terms of the ethics, and see how they would respond to these things. So when we did that, I mean, if you have somebody who has their ethics screwed on right, the idea that creating a classroom environment that quote unquote and re-privileges it so that straight white men aren't allowed to talk, aren't allowed to have their questions answered by the instructor, and are encouraged to sit on the floor in chains to learn experiential reparations, maybe should raise a red flag that this isn't, a great educational idea. Or a paper that says we're going to go to a dog park in Portland, Oregon and watch dogs hump each other for a year, 1,000 hours, in fact, over the course of a year, which is 4 hours a day if you took it just like a work week. So we're going to watch dogs hump each other for 4 or 5 hours a day every day, question the owners about their sexuality, and then derive a conclusion that therefore dogs condone rape culture. That, there's certain leaps here that a scholar who's trying to derive rigorous conclusions, especially conclusions that have sociological merit, really, or educational application, or social work application, or practice implications in terms of how to deal with masculinity in a counseling scenario or something like that, as one of our papers covered. There are certain leaps here that somebody who is competent and rigorous and skeptical should have been picking up on, should have said, wait a minute, something's wrong here. And it depends on which paper we're talking about.
Well, yeah, no, is that built into the methodology of the peer review, though? This is me analyzing the field from your perspective, essentially. So, it's built into the methodologies of the, experts, sure. But like if they're supposed to be experts, fine. But even within that field, should there not be some sort of scaffolding that a peer-reviewed paper should meet? So when you say that the methodology, that was one of the things that you referenced. And I agree that there should be no ethics that allow for anybody being chained to a floor, period, full stop. That's a problem. That's a goddamn problem. That's a problem. But when I look at these things, I think to myself, clearly there's an issue in the methodologies of acceptance for publication in this field. But I don't want to just offhand, because of that, dismiss the efficacy or necessity of that body of research if we can somehow build a better scaffolding that allows the peer review process to be more rigorous in the same fashion that peer review processes are rigorous in other fields, so that when people do endeavor to do these types of studies, there can be some sort of measures in place to allow for the validity of the outcomes and interpretations of those research. So my questions are leading towards, I suppose, your suggestions as somebody who's now kind of more of an expert in the field, certainly more of an expert in the field than I am, of how it could be potentially reformed to be better utilized, so that rather than dismissing an entire field that could be legitimate study and potentially help us inform better social decisions, rather than discrediting it on its face entirely, just because in its current instantiation, it has some issues. Does that sound fair, or am I articulating that okay?
Yeah, sure.
So do you have any suggestions in that vein? Because I think you've made it clear that it's got problems. But now what is my answer, or my question? Now what?
Yeah, so reforming the rigor there is important. So, for example, if you want your research to be able to draw sociological conclusions, there is actually, there's problems in sociology itself, as people have pointed out. I retweeted, in fact, an article talking about it today. But that's not to say that there aren't rigorous methodologies that are understood and explored by sociologists. And we didn't succeed in getting any papers in any sociology journals, unless you count sex roles, which is interdisciplinary. And it's kind of on the edge, but not really. So if you want to draw sociological conclusions, maybe you should have sociologists actually review your methodology and make sure that it's rigorous enough to draw a sociological conclusion. It's just a thing. Like, if you want to write a paper that examines dog humping and draw the conclusion that to combat rape culture, we should train men the way we train dogs, you might want to have somebody who draws sociological conclusions professionally evaluate whether or not that's bullshit. Because
I agree.
And then to have reached that conclusion by allegedly analyzing it through black feminist criminology. as a matter of fact. I mean, just completely random stuff. So
that's a stretch. Okay. Yeah, all right.
I think if you want to draw, so there's multiple things here. If you want to draw sociological conclusions, you definitely should be bringing in sociologists or people with the necessary skills to evaluate sociological research. What we have here, in fact, in a lot of these cases, is we have humanities journals that are doing theoretical research, and they call it theory, and then they are drawing conclusions, usually through a deductive process that's kind of philosophical, but it's more sophistry, and they are conclusions that have sociological merit, but they don't get to those conclusions via sociological methods. So you have humanities disciplines pretending to be social science. And so the fix for that's easy. You require peer review to have sociologists when the paper has a sociological conclusion, or you allow for sociologists to criticize those papers on the back end and challenge their publication if they draw sociological conclusions and then aren't using rigorous enough methods to arrive at them. Now, if they want to do just humanities research, that's fine, but then there's no sociological conclusion to draw. One example from one of our papers, we wrote both quantitative, we tried to do a blended methods study with quantitative and qualitative data. And they told us at first, this would be, so if you're a psychologist, you probably know every social science major, at least in every program I know of, takes at least introductory statistics, and they're familiar with, you know, one-tailed hypothesis testing and things like that. So we had
a t-test, an ANOVA, Pearson.
Not even T, these are Z-tests. I mean, this was like freshman intro stats. So we submit this
anything.
Yeah, so we submitted this, and the journal's editor wrote back to us with a desk rejection and an invitation to resubmit the paper if we took the statistics out, because the statistics were too difficult. And so, but this is a problem because the paper draws.
That is a problem.
Yes, take all the statistics out. So because the paper draws sociological conclusions, though, and then after it goes through peer review, they were very warm to the paper, invited to revise and resubmit. We didn't have time to get it through, so it's one of the ones that we don't know if it would have gotten in for sure, but I bet it would have. And the first round of peer review came back, and they were talking about the methodology as we think they should have, but they didn't talk about it the way they should have. They said, you should take the quantitative data out of this and rely more on narrative to draw the sociological conclusions that we were drawing in the end. So this is a major fucking problem.
You can have a more emotional affect on readers by choosing that methodology in your report, because people are more likely to identify with a narrative than they are with a chart, for example.
This is what I'm talking about.
Okay.
So if you have
but are they
something that's humanities.
Are they recognized as a field that's under the no, not as a field in general, but as a field that's under that sort of the banner that you're assigning them? Like, I understand that they're drawing conclusions that can track on, but and it's okay within, and it's okay within media studies. Mm-hmm. So here's the difficulty.
And if they want to just write qualitative media study reports, that's fine, but they need to just be qualitative. They need to just be commentary. They can't. So if you want to draw a sociological conclusion, you can do both. That's fine. But if you want to draw a sociological conclusion, you probably shouldn't be excluding the statistics. You probably should not be excluding sociological rigor. Some of the other papers we did were philosophy. So of course there's not going to be that. But then you have the basic ability to analyze the soundness and validity of an argument, plus to examine the assumptions underneath it. That's
Steve's field.
So the paper that was about ourselves that went to Hypatia, that was actually a feminist epistemology paper. And the long and short of it was that it's unethical under any circumstance. It was about positionality, meaning who you are in society. It's unethical in any situation to use humor to criticize anything to do with social justice, because humor is only appropriately applied in defense of social justice. And if people try to do a satire or a parody of social justice initiatives, research, etc., activism, anything, then they're engaging in what Allison Bailey, that's one of their scholars, calls a shadow text. It means that they didn't really engage. So if you think that it's something that can be made fun of, you clearly didn't really engage with it, so your criticism is bunk. And so in essence, the theme of the paper was it's not possible to criticize this topic because criticism is proof you didn't engage it correctly. Go back to the drawing board. Any philosopher should be able to see straight through that. That's crap. My argument can't be criticized because if it is, you didn't read it right. That's the argument. That's the paper. This was called an excellent contribution to feminist philosophy. It was slated as by the journal and the peer reviewers as excellent, timely, very important. It was under peer review. Normally at Hypatia, it takes about 16 weeks to get through peer review. It was under peer review for 5. They loved it. It shot right through. It was extremely quick how it went through. It was amazing.
So I'm gonna ask Steve a question, if that's okay, because Steve has a background and expertise in philosophy that is beyond me, and I don't.
Where did I get this from? I'm a total layperson who had to study this on my own in the last 4 years.
Yeah, well, you're a bit of an autodidact in this area. So when it comes to analyzing this, when it comes to analyzing these types of things from a philosophical perspective, if it's clearly experiential, how do you, and you don't have anything referentially quantifiable, you're not gathering any statistics, there's no control, you don't have anything to reference that's showing an effect in any sort of scientific way, how could somebody in these types of fields utilize philosophical, like a written out philosophical logic or analytical philosophical logic in order to validate these types of positions, as opposed to just saying, I think this, therefore that, which is what it seems like he's saying, although, like I said, I'm not an expert in this field.
Well, I think James said it best. There's a huge difference between quantitative and qualitative analysis, right? So if you're running a paper or something and you're doing a qualitative thing where you're just showing how one thing impacts something else, and you're showing relationships, if one thing changes, how it changes to something else, I don't know how much inference you can draw from that, right? Without having a qualitative source analysis where you're saying mathematically this is the case, you're having statistics, you're having numbers, all that ANOVA fun stuff. That would be more of a quantitative situation. So I think a lot of these papers, if they're eliminating a lot of that number stuff, then they are. I don't see how they're drawing any inference or any conclusion from anything, because sure, it's theoretical and they can throw that out there, but James, if they're just doing something that's of a qualitative nature, where do they get these conclusions from? And why hasn't somebody said, you can't draw anything from this? You're just showing comparative type analysis in that case.
Well, I can't tell you where they get their conclusions from, but I can tell you where I got mine from. I started with the conclusion I wanted to get to, and I made the literature and my words do my bidding to get there. So the dog humping paper, the goal was to start with, can we make an argument that we should train men like we train dogs to combat rape culture? So we made that happen. Can we make a paper that says you can't make fun of social justice? So we made that happen. And then we put ourselves in it. We used ourselves, our conceptual penis hoax that I mentioned a minute ago. We used that as an example of failing to engage with the field and trying to mock it and so on. Could we start with the idea that maybe this crosses your language barrier, I don't know, but that transphobia in straight men, by which we mean the desire not to have sex with a trans woman with a penis, could that be combated by putting sex toys in one's ass? So we started with the conclusion that,
like, if you track
for some
what
people,
transphobia,
that's the definition we used. And so we suggested, we started with the conclusion that you could combat transphobia by having straight men experience anal sex toy use. And then we just made this stuff work until it got to that point. One of our papers rewrote a chapter of Mein Kampf because we wanted to see if we could get that strong grievance-based, angry kind of language that Hitler used through Mein Kampf to be acceptable within a social justice setting. And in fact, we took up the task with that paper of problematizing the idea that feminism can have, that a woman believing in her own right to do things in her own freedom and then acting upon that is inherently feminist. They call it choice feminism. We made a mess out of choice feminism and said that it's every real feminist's duty to be in solidarity with every oppressed person and make sacrifices upon everybody's behalf, which is exactly what we've been seeing in the news since the midterm elections. We saw it after the Trump election, where you see all these groups coming out and writing articles saying things like that white women threw women of color under the bus in the election. It was that theme. So, I mean, the goal was to start with the conclusion in mind and then get there. But that's the definition of sophistry. And I don't know if that's what they do, but I know that's what I did. And I know that I can get that published in reputable journals. In fact, I could go right now, if I had the names to work with, and get as many papers published in that way as I want, and they could not stop me.
Well, you said something that was interesting. You said a few of them got kicked back for like review, which means that it was, like you said, it was still live, and they were asking you for a revision, but didn't seem to hit on some of the more egregious things that obviously I would call them landmines of some kind. You put things in there that you wanted people to notice. And so somebody had to read this. Somebody actually had to, it wasn't like it was just by fiat said, we're not going to accept this. Somebody said, this is still viable. We want to have it revised. So what is it that they're peer reviewing? Now, from my understanding, I've never written a paper, I wrote a blog, but my understanding of peer review is that they're really just looking for more format, a method section, repeatability. A lot of the people that are reviewing have some kind of expertise in it, and I was talking to Shannon earlier about this. I do differentiate from the hard sciences to the more of the social and soft sciences, not saying that those are not sciences. They certainly are, and there's certainly a lot to be discovered from these types of academics. But when you have something along the lines of a paper that has no repeatability, and again, I do recognize even in the hard sciences, replication is a big problem in peer review. But what are they actually reading and saying that this is something that has merit enough to send it back to you and say, can you revise certain things? And when you got those back, were you planning to revise them? I mean, I know this got shut down early, but were you planning to revise them? And did any of them get revised and sent back and get submitted and published?
Well, yeah. So all 6 of the 7 that were accepted came back with revisions that we then made and then sent back. I forget offhand how many total we had that got the revise and resubmit status, but certainly at least 11 of the papers had that status at some point or another. So they would check the scholarly merit. They would say, oh, you used scholar X, Y, or Z, and their arguments tend to be this and that, and you've either encapsulated that correctly, or you need to develop this portion, or you need to say how it relates better to that other thing. There was much attention given to anything that had methodologies. So when they started getting more into the sociological type conclusions, if there's a methodology, nearly always we had somebody comment on the methodology. Sometimes they were quite complimentary. Sometimes they wanted small things addressed. Sometimes they wanted quite big things. They wanted to know, for example, how we collected our data. They wanted to know where we claimed that there was data. They wanted to know how we engaged, say, one of the major tools that's used in this kind of situation is called thematic analysis. They wanted to know how we did our thematic analysis. They wanted to know how we coded the written materials, say, that we might be claiming to have analyzed. Typically what this would be is transcribed interviews or transcribed conversation. So we'd have this text, and then we would have claimed to have found certain themes in it via thematic analysis. And so they would analyze whether that was done rigorously or not, according to the standards in the field. And sometimes it was, for example, on the paper about the trans people and sex toys, there were 3 peer reviewers in addition to the journal's editor that read the paper at least. And reviewer 3, depending on the context for which I want to look at this, am I the guy doing the project that wants it to succeed? Reviewer 3 is like a pain in my butt. Am I the guy who wants scholarly rigor to be there? Reviewer 3 did his job, and I'm very thankful. And in overall, as a human, where I stand as a person outside of the context of trying to succeed at my project, I have to give whoever reviewer 3 is, because they're anonymous, I don't know, a lot of credit. Reviewer 3 was like, hold up, because we intentionally in that paper on the first draft, we did all qualitative analysis, and then we wrote it all up in quantitative statistical terms. And he is like, hold up, you can't do that. You can't use statistical terms if you didn't do a statistical analysis. I'm really concerned about this. You need to watch the language. You need to back up off of this. You need to, you know, reel that in. Mostly, though, it was cases where they wanted us to be more clear and more articulate about the theory, which is what they call their philosophy, that we were applying, and make sure that we had all of it there. Or it was a matter of attending to what seems to be kind of a social justice-based network of offense-based rules, like that when we write an article about race from the perspective of a white author, we don't inadvertently position ourselves as being a good white person. Or when we write a paper about fat bodybuilding from the position of a professional bodybuilder, which is what we did for fat studies, that we acknowledge and make a problem out of our own thin privilege. So there's a lot of what they asked us to do was this theoretical crazy stuff to do mostly with the way that the theoretical lenses through which they interpret the world, and to make sure that those things were adhered to. And it was really, really eye-opening to see how much there should be, where rigor should be, there's instead this kind of deference to the theoretical constructs and making sure that those are properly navigated.
Okay.
I would go so far as to say, for the most part, in what we called grievance studies, you have an expectation to follow the theoretical offense-based rules in place of scholarly rigor. They've completely,
so this was more,
like, peer review
agenda than
works.
rigor.
Yeah. The peer review works the way it's supposed to, but the peers doing the reviewing are looking for the completely wrong thing because they want to do this theoretical stuff.
I can't, though. Like, how could it work that you guys were lying and the data was false? So how could the peer review work the way it's supposed to? Because how otherwise, how could they have conceivably discovered that your data was false?
Okay, so first of all, this just depends again on the paper. Personally, I suspect that it's probably in the best interests of research that involves data for the journal to be able to request the data. So in the first draft that we submitted of the dog park or dog humping paper, we actually had a sentence in there realizing that they might request our data because it was so absurd. I mean, anybody should have been able to see through that data. We claim to look at the genitals of 10,000 dogs in a year. There probably aren't even 10,000 dogs that go to 3 dog parks in Portland. It's the same. I've been to the Portland dog parks. The same dogs come over and over again. There probably aren't 10,000 that you see in a year. We claim to examine the genitals.
You couldn't have used your real names either, though, right? Like, you couldn't have used your real name.
We did not use our real names.
Because they couldn't have validated what institution you were from or what your credentials were either.
Oh, we made those up. That's how we ended up getting caught out.
You can validate credentials, though. So they didn't bother to validate your...
No, and I don't actually think necessarily...
Did you construct actual data sets? So if they did ask,
no,
did you have the data sets available? Okay.
Nobody ever asked us for the data until afterwards, when they realized that they might have been caught in a sting. So the data were, in general, pretty ridiculous. Although in some cases they were less ridiculous. In the dog humping paper, they were extremely ridiculous. 10,000 dogs. We're writing down stuff about where the dogs poop on each other, which probably doesn't happen. People doing jumping jacks to try to get their dogs not to be in a fight. I mean, just really ridiculous stuff. And then we put in the first draft, which the editor of the journal saw at least, if not any peer reviewers, that we, at the end of the data analysis process, we put all of our data in a recycle bin. That was in the paper, that we recycled our data so that we put up a smoke screen so they couldn't possibly ask for it. But that's definitely research malpractice, especially with such ridiculous data. Other stuff we had a paper about, say, Hooters, the restaurant, I should say, with a B, restaurant. That's what those things are called, apparently. I learned that on Wikipedia in the process of this project. We have a claim there that we analyzed 1,000 minutes or 10,000 minutes or something ridiculous of tableside conversation, where I put a recorder on the table for 2 years every week and listened to people. We talked, and then I went home and analyzed the conversations for things. Anybody who would have been competent in understanding how data is used would have blatantly seen that this was very cherry-picked data, because the only data that ever got included in the paper was exactly the stuff that supported the hypothesis we were putting forward. So if it were representative of 1% of the conversations happening at that table, that's still the only thing that made it in the paper. And nobody said, what else did people talk about? So these are the kinds of things that, you know, if I were peer reviewing my papers, these are the kinds of things that I would have asked the researcher. Is like, is this table conversation representative? Can you provide examples of other things they said? Can you provide, you know, some of the transcripts of these things to see what a representative sample of table conversation looks like outside of? And sure, we could have fabricated all this, but it would have gotten very quickly almost impossible to do so if we'd been asked. But most importantly, even with the false data, we never treated our data responsibly. We always drew ridiculous conclusions from our data. And so, I mean, it didn't set off a red flag, for instance, in the paper about the trans people, that we claimed to interview only 13 men, but it was about straight people, and only 8 of the men were straight, and it's not even clear why we included 5 gay people. So we had a sample of 8 for that paper, and then we, of course, cherry-picked the data, and then at no point ever was it in any way clear that we were trying to, you know, work representatively. In fact, we based that paper off of the work of another scholar who, I guess since it's in the paper, I can name him or whatever, but it's not really important. And he emailed me and was like, what in the hell is this? And this was after the project had come out. He was like, what is this? You didn't get my theory right. You didn't even, like, this isn't how you do data. This isn't rigorous. What in the world is this? Why did you do this? And so I started a conversation with him, and he kind of agrees with me at this point. And I think we're buddies, but I haven't talked to him in a while. So in every single case, there's this situation
so there are
where
people that are doing kind of rigorous research in the field, though. Then by that,
sure, I think so. I think there are people. So, I mean, that's
do you fear that you're delegitimizing? Do you feel like you might be delegitimizing people who are actually putting themselves up to serious academic rigor in this field by them being included under the umbrella of publication that you've just exposed out of some issues? Or do
I'm not the one that's publishing crap.
I'm not. It's not an accusation about you, but do you think that this endeavor and the people's view on it afterwards too? People polarize, right? So I have had people approach me from both camps. I just had somebody post on Twitter that they're incredibly disappointed in me because apparently I'm not sticking it to you enough, and another person posts that they're disappointed to me because I'm too feminist. So, I mean, like, people polarize, right? People go in opposite. That's right.
You didn't know my entire YouTube career, by the way.
Right.
Yes.
So here's I'm always concerned about going forward. And this is where, I mean, I feel like we've covered the papers. Like, people have seen it elsewhere too. But going forward, what happens next is always what's of the utmost concern for me. And I think that people having, you know, equality of opportunity is important, and that understanding how we can mitigate for potential biased perspectives is important to be cognizant of. I think that it's very important that all of us understand and take into the consideration perspectives of all other people, and that's ubiquitous. And it's so there are people, and I'm not attributing this to you specifically, so please don't take this as a personal attack, but because this is so prominent now, and because of the book that's coming out with the whether or not social justice is a religion, and there are people who, yeah, what? Who's writing a book on that? Aren't you writing a book on that?
Not a book. Well, it's not a book.
Or a paper,
I'm writing
an essay
about
or something.
Yeah,
you're writing an
it's
essay.
15,000 words. It's awesome.
Okay, that's okay. Well, I'm excited to read it, but because of things like that, and we'll get into that because I'm interested in talking about that too. There are people using this to polarize, to say, okay, well, now you can write off those fields. Now you can just say everything that comes out of those fields is just garbage, and is not to be considered. And I think that pendulum swinging that far in the opposite direction is dangerous too, and needs to be kind of mitigated for in order to be responsible in this situation. Perhaps you have a difference of opinion, but what would...
No, actually, I completely agree with you.
Right. Okay. So what would your message be going forward, or what would your ideas be for how we should proceed from here in order to keep considering these things?
I'll tell you the same thing I told the professor that emailed me that asked me, why did you use my work to do this? And I said, you know, I'm not going to speak for you. I'm not going to speak for anybody. But if I were you, I would be pissed off that it's possible that these journals, the editors, the peer reviewers, are willing to pass off this abuse of your work. I've had sociologists reach out to me and say, you know, you tried to delegitimize sociology, or maybe this delegitimizes sociology by association or whatever. And I'm like, I'm not the one that's publishing sociological conclusions in good faith that don't deserve to be considered sociological conclusions. If I were you, I would be the maddest. If I were a sociologist, or I were one of these gender scholars that believes that they're doing, or race scholars or whatever, that believes that they're doing rigorous work, I would, like this guy who emailed me and agreed with me completely and said that he now considers, or having used his work to write one of our papers, a quote notch on his bedpost, I would be the most eager to try to initiate reform and to distinguish myself from what is clearly the legitimacy crisis that we were shining a light on. So no, I don't think that it can be said that we delegitimized anything. We put things forward that we hoped would get caught out, that we think should have been caught out at least anyway. If you want to try to catch us and say, well, in the context of the project, you wanted it to succeed. Well, no kidding, but that's contextual. We put garbage in expecting that it should have been caught. And it wasn't us that legitimized the garbage. We just put it in front of people who should have been able to sniff it out and couldn't. So the legitimacy crisis isn't on us. I mean, it's like if you had some kind of a corruption or infestation or something like that, and somebody comes in and shines a big spotlight on it. The person with the spotlight isn't the person who did something wrong.
So do you think the next step?
So no, I don't think so. My goal wasn't. But my goal wasn't to delegitimize fields or disciplines or approaches.
You can see how that's happening, though, from a public perspective. You must see. I mean, you have Twitter. I know you do.
Totally.
You must see how.
And if they're not willing to reform, they deserve to be delegitimized. I mean, they absolutely deserve to be marginalized if they won't reform. If they won't
but
get
you must
their
want them to, though.
No. I want their scholarship reform. No, I want them to reform. I want them to get their rigor up, or suffer the consequences of not doing so. I want right answers to questions. I want right answers to questions about race. I want the best and most rigorous scholarship to go into answering these hard questions about society. It should make things less polarized if we can defer to a more objective standard. Granted, it's social science, and an objective standard is going to be very difficult. But the more rigorous and the more objective that we can be, the less room for polarization and saying that's just your opinion and this is bullshit and whatever else that you have. I want these topics studied well because I want the work that needs to be done right, so that it has both effect and lasting effect. And the reality is, as the saying goes, that reality bats last. So if you come in with sophistry and you build your castle in the sand, when the tide comes and washes the sand out from under it and it falls, that's bad. You don't want that to happen. So you want to build this, if we're going to talk about race, and we're going to get to the bottom of solving problems about race, discrimination, social inequalities, persistent or historical or novel, whatever they happen to be, various issues of discrimination, sex, sexuality, you name it, right? The more rigorous the work that goes into that, the less room there is for a polarizing argument. We don't argue a whole lot about the shape of the earth, and I chose that one on purpose, because the evidence is
You're in the right place for that.
Yeah, well, not at all. We don't ever talk about that.
Nobody here ever talks about
taboo subject. There's no rigor in that.
So,
we don't discuss.
So, Yeah, so I don't want the fields to be delegitimized. I do want the methodology we call grievance studies that's operating to allow what we did to fall apart. Because that methodology, which is actually, if you want to get really formal, it is postmodern critical constructivism, is the problem. It is what is allowing people to operate on a theoretical basis and then claim sociological conclusions, for example, or bad philosophical conclusions that are not getting the necessary scrutiny that would weed out the bad ideas. And I don't want to stop people from putting forward ideas. This isn't an academic freedom thing. I want
and they could
people
legitimately
to put forward
have
ideas.
Great ideas, but you wouldn't. So what you're saying is every idea could have 100% merit, but what you're saying is you wouldn't know.
You can't know. That's exactly right.
So you're saying potentially they could be 100% right, but they could also be 100% wrong. And right now, there's no way of objectively deducing.
There's no way to determine it. That's right.
So where does
that's exactly right.
I gotta ask.
Okay, go ahead, Steve, and then I'll go.
What would be the problem with delegitimizing things that are not actually legitimate? Now, I'm not a big fan of feminist.
Nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Modernism. So I do agree. I can see people looking in and going, okay, what is the end goal for these types of things? Is it to delegitimize? Is it a satire? Is it to point out problems in the peer review process with them? And I'm sure, as you probably agree, there's a kernel of legitimacy in all this stuff, right? There are things that people should
about every single thing, every bit of it.
Absolutely. But I think that the problem is that the people that are in these fields, and this is from me as an outsider, again, I'm not a social justice person at all. I have a lot of criticisms about that kind of stuff, but from an outsider, all I'm looking at is I'm seeing people that are so indoctrinated and so willing to have cherry picked information and so willing to put forth a narrative, an ideology, and an agenda of all else. And that, to me, is what I see you have exposed and put a spotlight on. Now, if the people that are doing academic research, the people that are doing legitimate work, you're right. Those are the people that should be outraged, not the people going, oh, why are they exposing this? Why are they delegitimizing this? It should be the people that are wanting to do the actual work in a very methodical, meticulous way with an actual method section, with actual data. Those, I agree, should be the ones that be looking and going, you know what? We need to look at this and reformulate how we approach this type of academics.
That's an important question.
I have kind of flattened the affect, so it's. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, from a social science perspective. I'm sorry to step on your joke.
Well, not totally. I was going to say I flattened affect, so you can't tell. The joke is that I flattened affect, so you can't tell that I'm outraged, but I'm actually outraged on the behalf of the people who are trying to do rigorous work in this field, and then their work is being delegitimized by being published next to and difficult to distinguish from the outside. And that's what this guy I talked to by email back and forth a few times was talking about. He put forward this really interesting theory of masculinity about 10 years ago. And at first it was kind of like the new hot thing and it got really taken up. But I don't know how great his work is. I haven't analyzed it. He's a nice guy, I can tell you that. And I know his heart and his mind are kind of in the right place because he's talking about wanting to put it, he wants it to be rigorous. He's sick of seeing feminism, ideological feminism overrunning masculinity studies and kind of dictating what can and can't be concluded within masculinity. And he wants it all to be data-driven, good sociology, good rigorous methodologies for data collection and analysis and inference. And when he started fighting back against the fact that he felt like other stuff in the field was, the masculinity field was kind of ideologically corrupted, all of a sudden, bizarrely, his insights that were so darling a couple of years before had become problematic all of a sudden, and now they're sort of out of favor. And so I'm outraged on his behalf. I think it's likely I've looked into it some. I did butcher it for my paper, but I have a vague sense of what his work is about. And as far as I can tell, it was pretty interesting and insightful. If not, if it's not accurate or perfectly good, it's at least in the right direction, and it's at least participating in the knowledge production process where he's open to have his ideas debated, criticized, re-examined, refined, etc., which is completely different from you can't criticize this or else you didn't really engage with it, which was one of our papers that clearly is an idea that they accept. So I'm outraged on his behalf. I'm kind of, I guess, friends with him now. I'm outraged on behalf of other scholars that want to do this. I want to know, for instance, there are hard questions to answer about race and about gender, and about sex and about sexuality. I want to know what's going on with that stuff. I think that the field of gender studies, for example, should exist, even independent of everything that I've done. I think there should be space for a philosophical and synthetic discipline that looks at, biology, psychology, sociology, and then specifically the issues related to gender. And it can incorporate even elements of social constructivism, which is an interesting set of ideas. But it can't say that that's the only thing and then absolutely refuse to engage with criticism or anything that contradicts those conclusions. Mm-hmm. So I would love to see robust gender studies that studies gender in kind of a more global way than, say, sociology alone can do. Some people have tried to tell me that evolutionary psychology already does that, but I think that would be kind of like a niche discipline within a broader spectrum of stuff that would have space to be explored under the canon of gender studies. So I just want the stuff to be done rigorously, and I seriously didn't think that was happening, and my colleagues didn't. So we proposed to try to, put some bricks of cocaine through their system and then point at their scanners not working.
Interesting. Okay.
But it wasn't actually that their scanner doesn't work, it's that they like cocaine is the problem. It's like, they rub their fingers and they're like, oh God, this is okay. Thanks. We'll scoop a little out for ourselves and let's go. The problem isn't that their peer review is not rigorous. What's that?
It's that they're looking for an outside perspective. I have a bit of a hypothesis regarding the field. So there's legitimacy to the perspective that people, at the very least, feel a sense of oppression or are affected by the intersections, specifically in society. And, there are some studies that focus on that in legal precedents. Sure. Because it's undeniable that those things exist, and it's incredibly difficult to quantify perspective. Incredibly difficult to quantify perspective. Perhaps there's a natural overreach because perspectives are legitimate by virtue of their existence. So if I dictate my perspective for you, it's legitimate, if I'm being honest, by virtue of its existence within me. So allowing that to be true, if you don't look at the field as though it's scientific, if you instead look at it as the accumulation of people's perspectives for our external analysis, then the quantification... So if you make it the
humanities being the humanities.
Right.
Instead of drawing sociological conclusions.
Yeah, no, I don't. So it could be the manner in which it's presented and understood externally as opposed to its existence, because there's value in that as well, because quantifying perspective and experience specifically is very, very different because it's unique and individual. It's impossible to do on a larger scale. So there are value in those self-report sort of monologues to a certain degree. But when they become blanketed out as a quantifiable science, as opposed to existing as they are for our open interpretation and understanding, that's where the issue is. And there's a significant overlap in these dialogues, because people are like, well, it's not science because it's just perspective. And people are like, well, perspectives matter irrespective of science. And both of those things have merit, and nobody seems to be proposing, how can we consider both of these things as equally valuable, find a way to do the science in its own right, and isolate the perspectives and find a way to consider them as valuable on their own.
So it depends on what you're trying to draw as a conclusion. So it depends on what you're trying to draw.
Conclusion that you're trying to draw. Why does it need to be a conclusion? Why do you need to have a conclusion for the existence of somebody's experience? Why does that require?
Because let me tell you why. First of all, perspective is not true. Perspective is an experience, but if I look out the window and I have the perspective, I witness an airplane with its lights, it's nighttime here, flying toward me, and I decide that what I've really seen is the International Space Station in its orbit, which is highly reflective when it's near the horizon and looks really bright. And I go in and I'm all excited that I saw the International Space Station. It's not reliable. That's correct. So listen and consider, but not listen and believe. So perspective isn't true.
Sure.
In fact, we're very, very good at fooling ourselves. We're very, very good at injecting our cognitive and other personal biases into our perspective and then drawing incorrect conclusions. So here's a story about why, and of course this, I guess, is sort of an atheist podcast. I don't think. How do you
learn what's correct then? Like,
well,
if you
do you take it at face value? Like if a Mormon tells you that they know that the Book of Mormon's true because they have a burning in their bosom, and that's a perspective that they have. It's a sensation that they had. Obviously, there's skepticism there, and you would be like, well, no, there's probably, blah, 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 triggered a serotonin surge or whatever it is that leads to that sensation. So the perspective is information, but it's not reliable information in terms of deriving conclusions from it. Now, if all you want to do is talk about your experience, that's humanities qua humanities. That's fine, but you're not drawing a sociological conclusion. So here's an example of a practice conclusion, or we can talk about a sociological one afterwards if you want, but a practice conclusion. Why did we write a rewrite of Mein Kampf and send it to a social work journal? Well, a number of anecdotes from social workers in our lives across 3 different states in the United States indicated to us that over the past few years, one of the standards of social work practice is, let's say that I go and I do I don't actually know what it's called, so I'm going to call it an intervention, but that's the wrong word, and I know it is, but I just don't know what the right word is. I go and do a house visit, let's just say that, with a Black person, and I ask this Black person who's struggling, obviously, if the social worker is showing up, there's struggling going on. I say, do you feel like racism is a part of why you have the problems you have? And that person starts talking about their own experience and says, no, I don't think racism is part of that. I think it's this, and I think it's that, and I think this, and whatever. But they happen to say no. Okay? So I ask, do you think racism is a part? They say no. That's the hypothetical situation. It is becoming standard practice in social work for me as a social worker to instruct them to shift their perspective until they see how it is racism by teaching them elements of critical race theory that says that we live in a white supremacist society, blah, 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 and axes of power and all this other stuff.
Well, that's the opposite. That's invalidating their experience.
It's exactly what it is. And that's becoming standard practice in social work in at least 3 states.
And under any other circumstances, it was a different perspective you were trying to indoctrinate somebody. It would be unacceptable behavior.
Bear with me another step here. So 2 weeks later, I come back to the same house and I say, do you think that racism is part of your experience? And after I've given them a couple of lectures in critical race theory and how to spot racism in their everyday experience that they didn't think were racism and didn't use that word for, now they say, oh yeah, here are the examples of racism that I experienced. And then there are real life examples that they had that 2 weeks before they would not have perceived as being racist, but after I told them that that has to be considered racist because of privilege plus power equals racism, now that they have to experience that as racism, they say, oh yeah, so it meets the definition. So I have, in a sense, found a way to take their interpretation of an experience and inject racism into it. If I were, say, a Mormon priest, I think they're priests, and I were to tell this little child who has this overwhelming sense of awe that's made them all light up over something cool, that is the sense of God burning in your heart. And 3 weeks later, do you ever experience God? Oh yeah, I saw a rainbow and oh my gosh, I just lit right up. That perspective has now been coached to a particular kind of thing. So the conclusion one draws from one's perspective isn't necessarily reliable. So this becomes a problem, but I do think that the right answer is to listen and consider. Certainly listen and consider. If I go as the social worker and I say, do you experience racism or whatever? And the person's like, yeah, here's all this racist stuff that happens. And then I go to another client, patient, I don't know. I go to another person that I'm doing service work for, and I say, do you experience racism? And they say, yeah, and it's like this, it's like this, it's like it. For me to go and dismiss that and not pay attention, especially if I could try to derive a pattern and say, oh crap, in this particular county, there actually is a particular racist problem going on at the post office or whatever, that's also not the right thing. It's not to say listen and dismiss. It's not to say listen and believe. It's listen and consider. So people's perspectives are data, but they're unreliable data, and they are a cause to do more rigorous studies when they bear sociological conclusions like that the post office is racist.
But yeah, sure. But if you see consistency, I completely understand that. I understand perspectives are unreliable. And like cognition is all across the board unreliable on multiple metrics, But as specifically perceptual cognition, when you reference seeing something, but emotional experiences have a different sort of affect. And if you consistently see across time the same sort of self-report emotional experiences, at the very least, like I think you would agree with, and it seems like you're saying, that would present an issue. Like if you can see a certain conglomeration in certain areas over certain demographics that are consistently reporting the same types of experiences without being primed, like you mentioned, because that's clear priming from the psychological perspective, without being primed, if they're self-reporting consistently these types of things, then that is an issue that does require further more rigorous analysis in order to draw better sociological or psychological conclusions. So I can see it, but you're saying essentially that that's not what this field is modeled around. This field is modeled around specifically deriving sociological conclusions as though it's a subset of sociology.
Can I
That's
interject
one of the
here
things they do a lot of, yeah, please do.
Okay, so when it comes to our perceptions, I think maybe Shannon was trying to say that our perceptions are valid to ourselves, right? Are there a concordance with reality?
Yes. Right.
Probably not most of the case, right? We all have a way we look at something, and 9 times out of 10, it's probably not going to be the correct way to do it. But we to ourselves, we have incorrigible beliefs that are valid just from the mere fact that we believe them, right? But
exactly, yeah.
When we're looking at things from a and I hate to use the whole persecution versus privilege type thing, like intersectionality or whatever.
No, go right into
talking about
it.
race, like that. Yeah, because I mean, it does dive into that. When we're looking for offense, when we're looking for things that are egregious to us, when we're looking for, like you said, racial overtones, when we're looking for things like to say, oh, this was against women, or this was against this particular class. I think a lot of us people go out. Well, I don't want to say us because I try not to, but people go out of their way to find something to be offended by. And we just had an actual topic on this recently. The right to offend, and a lot of people bring up the thing where you don't you have to be willing to be offended, right? People can't just offend somebody. You have to have the willingness to say this affected me in some way. Now, I do agree that being affected is a legitimate perspective to themselves. When people are outraged, I don't think a lot of them go out of the way to feign outrage. Some people, yes, of course, but those are outliers, and I don't even want to deal with those. So the people that actually have real considerations, I think that they do have things that need to be addressed, but I think that you're absolutely right that you can actually manipulate people to have an offensive things toward anything, given, like you said, a narrative to give them for them to latch onto, right?
Yeah, which is why you want this, I think, to be as rigorous as possible.
Exactly.
So what you're actually talking about? Oh, go ahead. You go ahead.
I'm just going to finish it with. There's a very distinct difference between, some, like I was ex-Mormon, so I do know what you were saying when your relationship to. I know that this is true, and back in that day, I would use that vernacular. But before then, I didn't know anything about epistemology. I didn't even know what it meant to know something, and
totally.
Reading about theories of knowledge, reading about Getty Air problems, reading about justified true belief, reading about all these things. What constitutes knowledge is a huge, huge field, and I think people throw that around very loosely. I know this to be the case when even when something that is comporting to reality, even something that you can say is the truth and that you believe it, there are arguments to be had. Even then, you may not be justified to know something.
Exactly.
So I know exactly what you're talking about on this, and I couldn't agree more that in what your conclusions are.
So in the methodology we called grievance studies, there's actually a technique where you said people go and they kind of look to be offended. There's actually a technique. It's called problematization, where the goal is to look for the problem in the thing. This is direct from postmodern analysis, that you're supposed to look for the problems in a thing, and then you try to make the problems more visible. They often phrase this now as make oppression visible. So they try to make the thing that is a problem more visible. It's Christmas, so of course we get to hear it about Baby It's Cold Outside. Of course we get to see it about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer made in the 50s, about how problematic this element or that element is. You can't watch a Disney film anymore without figuring out all the different ways it's problematic. Somebody's going to host the Oscars, they're problematic. This tool is the heart and soul tool of grievance studies. This is how I wrote my papers. The conclusion was always to make a problem out of something. To look for ways to be offended. And when this stuff gets incorporated into educational curricula, so required, first of all, it gets added to curricula in existing courses sometimes, but also it gets, a lot of universities now require a unit on diversity and inclusion, for example, at freshman level or something like that. What used to be freshman orientation or introduction to research or whatever they made people take. I had to take 2 of them, whatever I took in the 90s. Now it's often diversity units. What do you think they teach? They teach you, what's right and wrong, politically correct behavior, but they also teach you how to problematize various things that you probably didn't make problems out of before. And that's part of why we called it grievance studies, as a matter of fact, is it's seeking to make problems.
Do you see, because I, again, as an outsider, I personally see this when I look into the scope of this. I see people telling people what to be outraged about in when it comes to a lot of these.
Oh yeah, so I'll give you an example.
That's why I get bugged.
Totally, and to be outraged on somebody else's behalf about, who may not even be bothered by it. So for our paper that was about ourselves, about humor and positionality, we used Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert as examples of comedians who were taking the right view on social justice. And then we were requested by the peer reviewers and the editor of the journal to nuance that section because Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert are straight white men. And so the editor of that journal actually included a note to us, an editor's note in the peer review, in the review comments, that said that she often finds herself watching Stephen Colbert and yelling at the screen, saying that was awfully cis white male-y of you there. And then she said she often becomes so outraged. I'm not kidding. You can go read this. I published the emails they sent us. It becomes, she said that she gets so outraged over this sometimes that she forgets what he even said. Why she decided to divulge this information, I'm not quite sure, but nevertheless, here it was, our paper, to become sufficiently nuanced, now had to add nuance about the positionality of comedians who take the right position on social justice, but do so while being straight, white, and male, and therefore their positionality as a straight, white, male person complicates the issue because Stephen Colbert is sometimes way too much of a straight, cis, white male, and he shows it by being very cis, white, male-y. So
there could be some legitimacy to wanting other perspectives to be included if that's your tack. Though. So
sure. But I have been told as a cis white male that my positions are invalid regardless of what I have to say, just because.
And
you're also a white supremacist.
And that happens more often than people actually think.
But that shouldn't negate the requirement that you consider other people's perspectives, specifically. Like if you, as somebody who does research, you want a robust demographic. And if you're specifically studying something that has to do with what you would perceive as a marginalized demographic, if you have key points that are presented in that paper that are from a perspective of somebody who isn't a marginalized demographic, I can see why they would. I mean, that's a ridiculous anecdote. Like that the girl makes no sense. But like disregarding her clear bias, I can understand why somebody in that scenario would want ulterior perspectives from somebody who's more representative of a group that's being discussed.
But I can understand why, or there's a kernel of truth that is rarely enough to conclude a robust conclusion upon. And that's sort of what's happening here. Exactly.
I find myself playing devil's advocate a bit because I've in my heart, I want to retain these studies, and I find myself, if I'm being honest, couching the line between wanting to find ways to reform this group of research without, like I mentioned earlier, delegitimizing it entirely by engaging in sort of anecdotal rhetoric that people latch onto, because I understand a little bit about how people work, and people latch onto that sort of rhetoric, and they're like, yeah, well, obviously the people that are in charge write this sort of shit, and because the people that are in charge writes this sort of shit, obviously the whole thing can be disregarded. And that is dangerous too. Like I mentioned before, that pendulum can swing really far in the opposite direction. Like, this is all awful. Like, I wish it was that easy to submit papers, right?
Would you like another fun example?
What I personally take the most out of umbrage is that when people focus more on the messenger than the message, right? When you are focusing on those types of myopic things and not focusing on the big picture, this leads to what I think is groupthink. This leads to what I think is ideology. This is what I think that this kills any kind of a movement that, as you keep pointing out, has a granularity and grain of truth somewhere. There is legitimacy to be had in many of these things.
Most of the concepts are actually pretty clever.
No, I'm totally down with that. But when I see people being marginalized for the source, by saying this person is not either qualified to make this narrative, and that's not because of their academics, but it's because they happen to not fit the demographic, I have a huge problem with that.
Yeah, it undercuts scientific universality completely.
Right, and the general public doesn't understand what type of research methodology holds any sort of degree.
But they do understand simple things like that if something's true about the universe, it doesn't matter who does the study, it should get the same answer.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I'm not disagreeing with you on those points. I'm just saying that, when people, and this could actually track well onto your point, like when people see something published in a legitimate journal, most people don't go through the source methodology. They just see legitimate journal.
No, they see the conclusion and they say there's a study.
If they even look at that, most of them just, or they just read the abstract because that's all they can see in front of the paywall. Right?
I mean, totally, to be honest with you, I probably only did that for about 2/3 of the papers we cited. I only read the abstract.
Oh gosh, that hurts.
Good enough.
No, I think you're right in that. A lot of people quote the things that they don't bother to actually read the actual paper. Now, again, I read abstracts as well, but I actually have a collection of papers that I've been reading, and I know, God forbid, we actually read actual paper, right? But
see, we were doing a paper every 2 weeks, so we didn't have time to read 40, 50 papers per.
No, well, yeah, but you had a different, I hate to say it, but you had a different agenda in mind, right? But when people are using a persuasive argument, or people are trying to put forth something that they want to get across, and they want to cite academic sources, sometimes I've seen them, again, cite papers that aren't really have anything to do with what they're talking about. And it's clear that they've never read them, right? But they're seeing a title and they're going, hey, this supports my agenda. I'm going to throw this out there. And I'm not saying we all haven't done that. I'm guilty of that as well. Sure. But I try to minimize that at all possible. Sure.
And that's a problem.
I wish people would just do that overall. Like, honestly, even if I see an article, I said earlier today to somebody that they said they found a reputable source. And I said, in this day and age, I don't know what the hell a reputable source is. Like, I go into, if somebody's discussing something, I go to what they're reporting on directly to try to find out what it actually says for myself, rather than I feel as though you can't necessarily trust much of anything, because we live in an age where we're inundated with information, and information doesn't equate validity, but people attribute it validity. Yeah, but most people don't go
papers that are against what I'm saying. I think that if people actually, instead of looking for confirmation, if you go out of your way to find stuff that actually is against your position, that's how you steel man your own position. That's how you shore up your arguments. That is what I definitely try to go do on many different things. Is I'll go to Google Scholar and I'll go, okay, what paper can I find that actually is completely the antithesis of what I'm going for here?
Yeah, and in this realm, there's so much pressure, because everybody wants to tell you.
Our paper about ourselves was that. That's okay. It's okay. I'm like kind of enjoying my lag. I kind of move and watch myself move a half second later, and it's sort of funny. I've never stopped being a child.
That's good. Don't ever. It's no fun otherwise. I haven't either.
Oh yeah, I mean,
so I feel like
I got to tell you, my childishness is what I actually really like about myself. I don't want to grow up. Getting
Yeah, you
old
should
is
read
not
some of
as
our
fun as
papers
people
if
may want to
childhood
be.
this works for you.
Oh my gosh,
You know what? Send them my way.
we're so
I'll
close.
send you the whole.
I don't even think we can get
They're
into that.
childish.
I wanted to talk so much about the social justice and religion, and we don't even have a chance to touch on it. Really, we're already at an hour and a half.
I don't want to
We're
give
gonna
too
get
many
a part
spoilers. My view is so completely novel. I don't want to give too many spoilers. Anyway, so it's okay.
Fine.
People will have to read all 15,000 words.
I will read all 15,000 words because I can't.
Definitely want to read them.
It doesn't track in my mind how the two.
Because I will tell you, I'm watching all the articles that are coming out. I'm watching, John McWhorter talk with Steven Pinker. I'm watching Andrew Sullivan write this stuff. McWhorter's written some stuff before. Pinker has written some stuff. Haidt has written some stuff.
Right.
I've seen all this stuff coming out. People are barking. It's like a bunch of dogs. I said the other day, I'm not putting anybody down. It's like a bunch of dogs barking up the right tree, but dogs can't climb trees. And I'm sitting up in the branches hoping that they don't get so loud that nobody will hear me. My view is really different. It's going to be very difficult, I think, for people to pick up. And Helen has been Durkheim through Haidt at the beginning. That's part of it, yeah. Then I go into
Haidt used Durkheim.
Yeah, and so then I do that in one part, and I go into Kolakowski in terms of the presence of myth, or it's a mythology. And then I have so much background through having done the atheist thing where I get into faith and I get into epistemology, and then I've been observing this stuff in the scholarly canon. I've been seeing how it's been institutionalized. So it goes into pretty much the whole thing.
I can't critique you because I haven't seen it, but
I don't want any spoilers. I don't want any spoilers. So you don't have to answer this question, of course. But so you are kind of using Durkheim's thing for religion to try to say that in some ways social justice can be considered or construed a religious methodology using Durkheim's definition of religion. Is that kind of the direction you're going on that?
Not quite. Yeah, not quite. So
sounds like it's augmented through a couple lenses.
This is what I really
lenses are applied. So this is really the approach that I'm using is taking several different ways. So you see a lot of these articles, for example, that draw parallels, and they say, well, privilege is like original sin, and being woke is like being born again, and different things like that. And they draw these parallels. And so there's a lot of the parallelism going on there, but I want to explain how the parallelism works in terms of these lenses. And so with the Durkheim part, I will point out
that to Christianity? You were tracking it just to Christianity, typically monotheistic Christianity.
Well, Christianity is, of course, what we're going to be most familiar with and is going to be the most rooted in a, Western Anglo. There are analogies there, yes, for sure. But what I'm trying to do with it is, like with Durkheim, I want to point out Durkheim's approach was to look at it as moral communities that have taken up certain additional attributes.
Sacred
objects and so on. And so it's like the point of the approach that I'm using is like, here are these different ways religion has been characterized, and here are ways that social justice as an ideology and community in service to that ideology satisfy some of those requirements, but not all. And here's why I think it goes different, where it's different. So, to tell you the big conclusion, by the way, here's your bait.
Here's the spoiler.
I am going to say it's not a religion. Social justice is not a religion.
Oh my God!
But it's close enough where we should treat it like one.
There's some. Would you say there's comparatives between the two?
Oh yeah. In fact, I say it's close enough where we should treat it like a religion. Okay. It's not a religion, and I specify why, and my reasoning is completely novel. And
in the way that it could morph into an ideology that could be adopted by a large group of people as a moral structure?
It's already done that. In fact, I refer to it, in parallel to organized religions like, Christianity or Islam. I refer to it, in fact, as a disorganized religion.
But then you'd have to prove that morality is tantamount to religion in order for that to track, and there's many other components in order for it.
Yeah, that's not going to work. So you'll see. Not to make you
no spoilers.
All right,
Doctor Who reference.
Listen here.
Listen.
No. We're gonna be on the same team against somebody else. That's right. We're gonna become friends right now, right? I want to publish it now. I want to put it out today. I'm done. I'm done. But Mike Nana, who is the filmmaker that's documenting our grievance studies thing, he's doing a documentary about it. If you guys haven't heard, he's got a YouTube channel about us that puts up new videos here and there. Just his name, it's Mike Nana, Nayna. But anyway, he is making companion videos to make the medicine I'm writing go down. Like, he's got the sugar, I've written the medicine. And so he's making companion videos, and video takes a lot longer to make than writing does. So he's doing that, and he is the thing slowing this process up. But that's good, because it's giving me more time to refine it than I would otherwise take on it. So we can blame Mike. I want to blame Mike that it's not already published.
Where's Mike?
Damn it, Mike. Damn it, Mike. Get in here, Mike.
I have to give Mike so much credit, though, because I didn't want to write this thing in the first place, and I have thrown massive fits and temper tantrums like the most spoiled prima donna writer in the history of writers, because I never wanted to write this thing in the first place, and he kind of forced me to, or talked me into it, or coerced, or however you want to phrase it. There was no force involved. He lives in Melbourne. He couldn't do it anyway, but it's really far away. He has urged me with great urging to make this happen. And so if he hadn't, it wouldn't have. So he deserves credit, and he is also the slow thing at this point. But we'll get there, hopefully soon. Because he wants the points to be vivid and obvious and not get lost in 15,000 words of text. That's actually, as Helen put it, this is a bit of hard work.
There's merit.
I think it's kind of the first couple of sections of the essay are the hardest, because they lay out some of the theoretical stuff that people are unlikely to be familiar with. So I've referred to it on Twitter a couple times as like trying to eat an entire box of grape nut cereal in a single sitting to get through that part. It's really dense and crunchy and heavy. But if you get through it, Helen and Mike are the only two people who've seen it other than myself at this point. Helen says it's one moment after another once you get through the beginning. So I think it should be illuminating when it comes out.
Okay.
But I do argue it's not a religion.
That's interesting. Okay. Because interesting.
It's real close.
I want to read it.
It's really similar, but it's not one.
You have to promise to fight with me about it later, though, Jim. I'll read
really
it.
Have to.
No,
I
I
suppose you
don't have to. I can be compelling, though.
She's got to learn the urging with great urging, and this is not.
I've taught her well on how to get a good dumpster fire.
Yeah, okay.
The best.
I amp up.
So anyway, that's the essay, and I probably shouldn't say too much more about it because I'll start giving away spoilers, because it's all I've thought about for like 3 weeks.
Interesting. All right. I'll read it.
I've been working on the topic that led to all this. Like, the various pieces have been things I've been researching since like 2013. So it's the fruit of many years of investigation and lots of different lines of thought being drawn upon at once. It's different.
I'm interested in how you get to the conclusion that it's not a religion, considering that it seems as though the perspective that is
You'll
blame me for making it a technicality.
Yeah,
I don't think it's a religion personally. I honestly, I'm not a fan.
Well, it depends on how you define religion.
Well, Dirk, I would use a belief system, but I don't. To me, there's a specific things for what incorporates would be a religion. Now, is there religiosity? Sure. Is there dogmatism? Sure. Is there ideological components? Absolutely. But I'm not going to go out of my way to say that social justice is some kind of religion. I think that's a conclusion I'm never going to be able to get to. But is there parallels between religious beliefs and things that I've seen in the social justice movement? Then yes, I'd have to say there's a relationship there. But to say something's religion, I'm not going to. That to me is like using the narrative of cult, right? And people throw out these words like, oh, it's cult, it's a cult, it's a cult. And to me, I use the term cult for things like Heaven's Gate. I learned, or things like the really egregious types of mentalities where there is an indoctrination. I don't call things like Jehovah's Witness a cult. I don't call Mormonism a cult, not by any stretch of imagination. Now, I know people do. I think it waters down the terminology, right? But this is all individual usage of what we want to label these things. But I don't see a need to call social justice a religion, because I think it waters down any possible kernel of truth or validity they might have, and it just nullifies it all as a whole.
Now you're talking about why I didn't want to write this, because doing it right is so difficult, because it's such a narrow eye to put the thread through to get it correct.
I can totally see that.
You have to say what needs to have been said without saying either too much or too little. I mean, I've thought about it for at least since 2014, specifically in the context of social justice stuff that was happening. And it's just an incredibly small eye of the needle to get the thread through. So you can thank Mike as much as you're cursing him.
Thank you, Mike.
He made it happen.
Good job, Mike.
Thank him by going to his YouTube channel and watching our other videos.
What was his name again on YouTube, for anybody who didn't hear it, just to reiterate?
Mike Nana. Mike is spelled the usual way, M-I-K-E, and Nana is N-A-Y-N-A.
Nana, perfect. I'll go check him out. Yeah, there's a lot of implications to that analogy. Even
he's a man, babe. You guys will love it. Yeah. So it's really it's a complicated essay, though. I hope people will read it and engage with it. I've been trying to get it geeked up on Twitter beforehand, because it's so long. I don't think anybody's going to want to really read it, and so there's already like a Reddit thread making fun of it or something, and it's like it's not even out yet. It's like, oh my god, never try. Was that Homer Simpson?
Always try. Just because of the implications of the analogy, I think, like it on its face, because there's so many implications of viewing something or having religious perceptions, like seeing things through a religious lens puts constraints on your perceptions, your ability to perceive things. Everything needs to fit into a specific box, and that box can be bent but never broken. If it's broken, everything falls apart, and you have to start reconsidering everything, right? You're not free to open conceptualizations and going where information leads you, because you need to exist within that constraint. So seeing those two as analogous is almost as though saying that it doesn't allow for views that comport with reality. And if you see the principles behind social justice as comporting directly with reality, and also as ethically and morally sound, then you're gonna get your hunches up, right? If you see the other as not, if you see this as comporting with reality. Social justice
people will not like this essay. They will not like this.
Shocker.
Who do you see as social justice people, though? I find that so innocuous.
Well, according to polling, it's like 8% of the U.S. population. So
I could be social justice people potentially, right? Like,
I have complicated views on all that.
Right? Like you could if you believe in equality of opportunity.
So I am careful to talk about the difference between capital S and J social justice as kind of an ideology versus lowercase social justice, which is a thing that I think everybody should be behind.
Yeah,
the idea that we do want a just society, the philosophical principle of egalitarianism, that we should want a just and equal opportunity society. I think that that's a principle that the vast majority of people actually subscribe to. Although I do call certain people, like people call them the alt-right or whatever, and I usually call them social injustice warriors.
So that you can make
because not everybody's necessarily.
No, I think that's a very viable distinction to be made. Like, for example, I don't label myself a feminist at all, although of course I hold egalitarianism and second wave and all that kind of stuff. And again, people have actually judged me for that. Well, if you're not a feminist, it means you're against women. No, that's not what it freaking means.
No, it's the term was co-opted.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. We never should give them the right to vote, but no, I'm kidding.
By the way,
there are people out there that do promote that. But yeah, I mean,
there are.
I think there's a huge standard to be said. The difference between people that are just an average person like me that's going to have equal rights, egalitarian, all that stuff, and then the capital, which is people that are actually promoting the agenda in a more direct way, and unfortunately in a more boisterous and not so I hate to say it, but not so much pleasant way, because a lot of the people I've seen that are the aggressors in the social justice movement, they're over the top. And that's what stands out, because one, people like to watch that stuff. It sells. It definitely sells. People watch these videos. and that's what the personage is going to be like for most of these people, because they know that's going to get them attention, right? And that's that's what's the most visible thing. But there are other forms, like you said, a lower social justice that I'm just fine with, of course.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, in fact, I learned in the project that I'm probably accurately described as both a liberal feminist and as a choice feminist, but those are highly problematic ways to be a feminist. So it's probably, I mean, when people ask me, are you a feminist? I always just say, well, what do you mean by that? I mean, it's a loaded term. So let's unpack what we are and aren't. Let's talk about it in terms of individual propositions instead of identities or ideologies. And then we'll determine what I am based on what I actually subscribe to and support versus, trying to pack a lot into a term.
I'm a huge fan of individual propositions at a time rather than this overarching umbrella of terminology. Even though people might not think that about me, I do take things propositionally an awful lot. So I agree with you.
Yeah.
Well, we've kept you for a long time. So thank you. I really appreciate
I'm a
you
talker.
coming to. Yeah, so am I. I don't know if you've gleaned that.
Well, we're going to need a part two, even if it's not on this channel. You two have a lot. I mean, this is your element, Shannon, and I can tell that you're just giddy as hell because you're in your sphere of what you've had a background, and this is way out of my depths, So I'm hoping that I'm just cogent in some way. But we are going to read some super chats real quick, and then we're going to start wrapping this up. We only had one, which is fine, but I'm so glad that people enjoyed this. I was looking at some of the stuff people are writing, and so far all positive. I don't think anybody had anything negative to say. And if they did, yeah, that's fine. I can't please everybody, but I'm looking for the backlash from the ultra social people that might come in later, leave the comments, and all of a sudden this gets like 50,000 thumbs down. But whatever, it's still a thumb, right? 0132132 for 666. What was the highest impact factor of the journals that accepted one of the articles? And it should be noted, and correct me if I'm wrong, but impact factor is generally how often something's cited, right?
Yeah, it's an average number of citations. It's something to do with the average number of citations over the past usually 2 years per article. So the journal would have been, so everybody can Google it and get what the actual number is now. The journal would have been Sex Roles. That has the highest impact factor. And that at the time, I want to say was in the 1.9 range. 1.95 is slightly under 2.
Which is fairly low, right? I mean, 3 is considered to be about an average, right?
Well, remember, Gender and Society is the biggest journal in the discipline at 2.7, 2.8, something like that. So we're talking about a pretty niche thing. Once you go within just gender studies, which is the biggest of the grievance studies disciplines, it depends on when you look, but like the highest ranked journal dedicated to this subdiscipline is usually around number 900 overall. So in the grand scheme of things, yes, these are low impact factor journals, but within the subdiscipline of gender studies, or related fields, they are significant in many of the cases. Some of them are really small and niche, like fat studies, etc. That is what it is.
Awesome.
Makes a lot of sense.
All right, before we go, I just want to say one thing to the audience. If you are interested in this topic, as I always say at the end of my own videos, please be an advocate for your own understanding. Don't just take it at face value. What I say or what James says or what Steve says, please go do your own research, do source research, go and look at the articles or the papers that were written and how they were submitted, look for ulterior sources, form your opinions, not just based on this conversation, but based on you being an advocate for your own understanding. Please take it upon yourselves to do that. That's something that more people should do.
Let me throw in on that. If you want, you can look up the write-up we did about our project on Aereo Magazine. That's called something like Grievance Studies and the Corruption of Scholarship. It's pretty easy to find if you Google Grievance Studies and Aereo Magazine. And in there, you can read our own words about what we thought we did. But there's also a link to the Google Drive, which is also on Mike Naina's YouTube channel. We put out a Google Drive that has all of our papers and all of the peer reviewers' comments unedited exactly as they were. So you can read it for yourself, make up your own mind about how their peer review was, make up your own mind about how ridiculous our papers were, how good they were. It's all out there in the public. We're not trying to hide anything. So go either through the Aereo Magazine source or go through Mike Naina's YouTube channel. And you can, if you go to some of the videos in the description, you can find a link that says to all the papers and reviewers' comments. And we've put out a drive about it. If you really need it, you can send me a note on Twitter. I can I'll probably get annoyed with having to do it a bunch of times, but we can get a link to the Google Drive, easy to find, and people can go look at it themselves. Just like Shannon said, check it out.
I love the fact that it's public. I do. That people want to go look at it. But
go look at
Shannon, you ready to wrap this up? Because if you got anything, say it now. Because Dave and I have something we want to.
I'm done. I'm
okay,
handing over the mic.
Awesome. First of all, Dr. Lindsay, this was great. These are types of discussions that are my absolute favorite. Lord knows I like the occasional dumpster fire. I've had enough of flat earth to last my freaking lifetime. I'm telling you right now, the last episode we had broke me. People even noticed it. I was done. I am brain fried with the absolute stupidity that is out there when it comes to these types of things like flat earth and younger creationism and all that bullshit. And so when we have discussions like this, you have no idea how much it revitalizes me and revigorates me mentally, physically, emotionally. It's I can't thank you enough. But anyways, Dave and I have something planned. We're gonna leave the audience with this. Dave, you ready?
Yep.
All right, let's go. Ready? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. We're not a sync.
Happy
birthday, dear somebody.
Happy birthday to you.
Is it you? Happy
It's the
birthday.
best thing that's ever happened. Thank you.
We'll never do that again.
Thank you. And also, please don't. Please don't ever do that. But thank you. That's sweet.
Never
it
again.
is sweet. Despite the look
Good night,
on my
all.
face. I appreciate it. Bye, guys.
Good night. Thanks.
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.